Ways and Means and District 9 City Councilor. Today is Thursday, May 25th. I'd like to remind folks that this is a public hearing and that it is both being broadcast and recorded on RCN Channel 82 and Comcast Channel 8. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence any electronic devices. At the conclusion of the department's presentation and questions from my colleagues, we will take public testimony. We have a sign-in sheet to my left by the door. We ask that you state your name, address, and any affiliation. We are here with the Director Golden and his team for a review of the fiscal 18 Boston Planning and Development Agency budget, docket 0536 through 0538, orders for the fiscal year 18 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, annual appropriation for the school department, and appropriation for other post-employment benefits, as well as dockets 0539 through 0543, capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I'd like to introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival. To my immediate left, at-large City Councilor Anissa Sabi George. To my far left, District City Councilor Josh Zakum, District City Councilor Frank Baker, and District City Councilor Andrea Campbell. I just want to read a brief statement from one of our colleagues who can't be here today. Please be advised that you are chairing the fourth hearing of the City Council's Ways and Means docket 0536 through 0543, Thursday, May 25th, 1 o'clock in the City Council's Ionella chamber. Sadly, due to a wake of a friend and community activist, I will not be able to attend this hearing. Please read this letter into the public record from District City Councilor Matt O'Malley. So with that, I want to again welcome Director Golden and your team for your opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and through you to the members. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Brian Golden, and I'm the director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency, the BPDA. Thank you for providing myself and staff of the BPDA the opportunity to present our agency's fiscal year 2018 budget. Before I proceed, I'd like to simply say on behalf of the agency, goodbye to City Councilor Bill Linehan and City Councilor Sal LaMattina. They'll be departing the City Council later this year, but I'm not sure when our next formal time down here would be. So I wanted to say thank you and farewell. It's been a great joy to work with both of them in my years at the BPDA. I know that staff who've interacted with them often in recent years have enjoyed the experience. The BPDA has certainly had a constructive and healthy relationship with Councilor Linehan and Councilor LaMattina, and we've appreciated their many courtesies as we've worked with them and their staffs to plan and build a better Boston for all. So again, on behalf of the BPDA, we wish them much happiness and success in their retirement. I'm joined today for this presentation by Chris Giuliani, our Director of Finance, Ed O'Donnell, our Director of Real Estate, Larry Momoli, our Director of Engineering and Facilities Management, and Midori Morikawa, the Deputy Director of Workforce Development and Policy Development at the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, the OWD, which falls under the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Now, the BPDA is charged with growing Boston's tax base, cultivating the city's private jobs market, training the workforce, working with the community to plan the future of our neighborhoods, charting the course for sustainable development and resilient building construction, advocating for multimodal transportation, responding to the city's changing population, producing insightful research on our city, and ensuring that Boston retains its distinctive character. That's what we do. The BPDA works closely also with our sister agencies in city government, the Department of Neighborhood Development on affordable housing through our inclusionary development policy. We also work with the city's assessing department on Chapter 121A in lieu of tax arrangements, as well as the Transportation, Public Works, and Parks departments on the impacts of real estate development in city neighborhoods. This past year has been a transformative year for development and planning in Boston, as we are continuing to experience one of the biggest development booms in the city's history. In 2016, the then Boston Redevelopment Authority assumed a new identity and a refocused mission that better reflects our goal to shape an inclusive future for all of Boston's residents and neighborhoods. A culmination of much work, the Boston Planning and Development Agency is better engaging with Boston's residents, focusing on comprehensive planning and smart development, and working with community partners. Our goal is to inspire greater trust and confidence from the people we serve. Some of our accomplishments from 2016 include the approval of almost $8 billion worth of development in Boston, representing over 14.7 million square feet, 12,586 construction jobs, and 7,239 additional jobs that flowed directly from development. There were 7,886 residential units approved. 1,661 of them were within an affordable category, and an additional $49 million was generated by residential development for the creation of affordable housing by cash contributions through our inclusionary development program. The BPDA completed a 10-year capital improvement plan, which identifies and prioritizes long-term investments in infrastructure projects to support future economic growth in the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, the Charlestown Navy Yard, Long Wharf, the China Trade Building at 2 Boylston Street, and the BPDA's other physical assets. Planning took center stage as planning guidelines for Dorchester Avenue in South Boston and the J.P. Rocks corridor along Washington Street were completed. 2 strategic planning area studies are now in progress at Dudley Square and Glover's Corner in Dorchester, and additional planning areas will be identified soon. Working with you, our urban renewal plan extensions were approved by the state's Department of Housing and Community Development during this current fiscal year. Salesforce, a new software platform for the BPDA, was launched, replacing several outdated legacy systems that have historically been kept and maintained separately by the agency. Long neglected projects like 115 Winthrop Square are moving forward after an open and transparent RFP process. The City of Boston now has a real opportunity to realize the tremendous benefits from this underutilized city parcel and make significant investments in our parks and affordable housing. while also bringing, of course, a dynamic mixed-use development to our evolving downtown. The development boom has brought more funding and community benefits and for the Neighborhood Jobs Trust. And we are turning that funding into meaningful investments in the city's people and the city's neighborhoods, including Mayor Walsh's tuition-free community college program for Boston public school graduates, new workforce training programs, and investments in affordable housing and open space. We remain committed to serving the public in a more efficient, accountable, and transparent manner. As a result of our work with KPMG, McKinsey & Company, and Continuum, we are continually working to implement solutions that modernize our operational functions and improve our planning and development review processes. We are constantly exploring new, innovative strategies for stakeholder engagement in all aspects of our work. As a result of our work with KPMG in 2014, all of the agency's leases, 126 in total, have been reviewed and abstracted for salient material facts, and over 1,100 lease documents have been scanned into Yardi, a lease management state-of-the-art software program. Yardi enables our staff to easily access lease information, produce reports as needed, and proactively manage the agency's lease portfolio. Our work with McKinsey led to improvements in our leadership and management structure, optimization of our real estate portfolio, the prioritization of planning in our city, and the streamlining of our development review processes. Recognizing that our work was not yet complete, we enlisted the help of Continuum, a global innovation design and organizational brand strategy firm, to help sharpen our focus, make the BPDA more transparent, and build a new culture that would best achieve our mission of planning and guiding inclusive growth in our city, while also creating opportunities to live, work, and connect for all. To achieve this mission, we're designing new systems, processes, tools, and communications to address 4 areas of focus, both internally and externally. 1, engaging communities better. 2, implement innovative new solutions. 3, partner with others for greater impact. And 4, track progress. The work has led to open houses being held in neighborhoods like Charlestown, Allston, Brighton, and East Boston, during which the BPDA staff has been given the opportunity to showcase our processes and big picture thinking to neighborhood residents. More robust use of our website to ensure that the public has 24/7 access to Article 80 development review documents, offering public tours of our model room, our scale model of the city of Boston, which is now booked through this summer and into October of 2017. And our budget is now published every year. This year, we're breaking ground on new projects in every neighborhood, including thousands of new residential units, helping us meet Mayor Walsh's housing goals in creating jobs for our residents. But we know that our work is not done. We are committed to continuing to evolve into an agency that better serves our community and creates an inclusive Boston for all. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to Midori Morikawa from the Office of Workforce Development.
Thank you, Director Golden. Good afternoon. My name is Midori Morikawa, and I am the Deputy Director of Workforce and Policy Development at Office of Workforce Development. I am here on behalf of Chin Nguyen, the Director at OWD, who could not be here today. I want to thank Chairman Siomo and members of the Council for the opportunity to speak about our accomplishments. Our office comprises of Office of Financial Empowerment, REIT Boston, and Youth Options Unlimited. The agency handles $17 million in funds that are distributed to a number of workforce and adult education partners, providing pathways to careers and financial stability for low-income Boston residents. Today, I wanted to highlight a few of the key accomplishments from our office this year. As Director Golden mentioned, last June, our office launched the Mayor's Tuition-Free Community College Initiative, which makes 3 years of community college education free to eligible low-income Boston Public School graduates. We developed this program in part to the fact that in Boston, by year 2020, 77% of jobs will require some form of post-secondary education or training, much higher than the national average of 65%. But over the last 3 decades, the cost of college tuition has increased nearly 4 times faster than the median income. We all know the correlation between the educational attainment and the wage attainment. The median lifetime earnings of individuals with an associate degree is 27% higher than the median earnings of high school graduates. For this reason, we wanted to provide an opportunity for low-income Boston Public School graduates to have the pathway towards post-secondary education. The program provides critical step in increasing lifetime earnings and for students to make higher wages due to the greater earning power of a college degree credential. With an initial cohort of 50 students, we are already seeing strong results. 94% of first semester enrollees successfully complete their first semester, and 74% of the students complete all of the college credits that they attempted. Another initiative I wanted to highlight is through our Office of Financial Empowerment called Boston Saves, also known as Children's Savings Account, which provides every kindergarten student in Boston Public School with a savings account with $50 in seed funding, with an opportunity for families to save and earn financial incentives, and to build a college and career-going culture. In pilot year 1 this year, Boston Saves was rolled out to 5 BPS elementary schools and engaged over 250 families and students, in which they received a CSA account with a $50 in seed account to get them started. This fall, additional 6 schools will join this pilot program, serving a total of 800 children. Another initiative I wanted to highlight is that our office works on a number of evaluation projects, including a summer youth employment program and the youth credit building initiative, to help us better understand what's working and what's not working so that we can better efficiently invest in programs that are working. For example, through our 3-year evaluation of summer youth employment program, our study found that by the end of the summer, participants who participated in summer youth employment program were more likely to know how to open a bank account, more likely to have a resume, and more likely to have plans for going to college. In addition, we compared those who had participated in summer youth employment program to those that didn't, the control group. And the number of violent crimes committed by youth in the summer program was 35% lower than the number committed by kids who were not part of the Boston Summer Youth Employment Program. The above programs and initiatives that I mentioned today represent just a small portion of the overall work here at OWD. We also have a number of other great programs that I didn't get to mention today, like the Greater Boston American Apprenticeship Initiative, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Midori.
Thank you. I think I'm next.
Okay, okay, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the City Council, my name is Chris Giuliani, Director of Finance for the Boston Planning and Development Agency. I have a short amount of comments here, I think. The Boston Planning and Development Agency, as a financial entity, is made up of 6 business units, 3 corporations, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Economic Development and Industrial Corporation, and the Boston Development Finance Agency, Industrial Development Finance Agency. We also have 3 associated 501c3s, the Boston Local Development Corporation, Right Boston Incorporated, and Friends of Youth Opportunity Boston. In addition, as Brian noted earlier, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development sits within EDIC. The BPDA is a self-funded agency, generating revenue to support operations through leases of its property, the operation of several parking facilities, and grants received by the Office of Workforce Development. These sources of revenue, these three sources, account for approximately 85% of our budget. BPDA does not currently receive any operating funds from the City of Boston, though in the past, the agency did receive an appropriation in support of its planning function. Currently, BPDA receives capital funds from the city. In the FY18 recommended budget before the City Council, BPDA is budgeted to receive $1.5 million for 5 projects next year, including design work on 4 projects, repairs to Dry Dock 4, Pier 6, and improvements to Black Falcon Avenue in the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, and Long Wharf on the downtown waterfront. A transportation study covering various neighborhoods is the 5th project. The amount budgeted for the BPDA in FY18 is a reduction from $5.8 million received in FY17. The 4 design projects funded by the city illustrate the substantial capital needs of the BPDA. With ownership of many properties, including large waterfront properties, and years of deferred maintenance, the agency has begun planning and funding a robust plan for capital improvements before costs become prohibitively expensive. We don't want our own Long Island Bridge. In addition, certain capital investments have been made or are planned to be made to increase recurring revenue to the agency in order to fund that capital plan. To that end, BPDA has made significant investment over the last few years in the China Trade Building at 2 Boylston Street, where the new Chinatown branch library is going, by the way. That will increase rents over the long term. We're also currently planning the expansion of the parking garage in the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park to meet demand of tenants and visitors to the park, as well as increase revenue. These investments are expected to be the basis of funding for capital projects in the Charlestown Navy Yard, the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, in both of those places, such as piers, dry docks, and seawalls, projects that are in the process of being costed and scheduled by BPDA engineering staff. With regard to our operating budget, we are preparing right now to deliver our FY18 operating and capital budgets to our board on June 15th. As such, I'm not able to share that budget today, except to say that we plan to build on the significant investments made in FY17 and the operations, long-term liabilities, and infrastructure of the BPDA, such as additional staff and funding for the planning department, reducing our other post-employment benefits liability, and repairs and investments to property that we own in the Navy Yard and the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park. Overall, through the current fiscal year, through the second quarter, the last time that we reported to our board, the current $61.6 million budget, operating budget, and $18 million capital budget are on target to close the fiscal year better than estimates due to 3 main things. The first on the operating budget is the receipt of a one-time lump sum payment from the sale of a lease in the Marine Industrial Park that increased revenue over budget. Second is higher attrition and slower hiring than was expected. That's kept our headcount lower than budget. And third, slower than planned capital spending on tenant improvements at the China Trade Building has pushed some capital spending to FY18. In closing, I would like to highlight some of the financial reforms that have been put in place over the last 18 months, 2 years at the BPDA. We are continuing our efforts around fiscal compliance with our leases and notes receivable, generating additional revenue for the agency. We are revitalizing our operating budget process to allow the agency to control headcount, manage to a budget during the fiscal year, project expenses to year-end and to out years, to increase transparency to the public around agency finances and operations. We are doing this by reorganizing the accounting department and creating a budget and procurement team that is reforming our procurement process, redesigning our accounts payable, requisition, and purchase order systems, and utilizing a module in our financial system that allows for easier analysis of budget to actual variances. And finally, we are planning for the first time, I think in a long time, to release publicly a budget book after our board approves that budget that should be available online. We have begun a capital budgeting process that details active projects, schedules, and costs future projects, and is based on a multi-year cash flow model. We have refinanced existing debt to avoid future interest rate resets, created a funding schedule for our other post-employment benefits liability, funded that schedule, and invested those funds with the state for investment returns. These are just a few of the ongoing efforts by the finance team to secure the fiscal health of the agency for years to come. That concludes my comments on the budget, and I think we're open to questions. Or back to Brian, maybe?
We're available, obviously, Mr. Chairman, for your questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just recognize a few people who aren't here, and Midori mentioned Trin Nguyen. It's been a pleasure working with her and you on the Jobs Trust. It's I think we've done some really great and innovative things, and showing much success and much needed skill levels for people entering the job market or just underemployed. Just some really great stuff going on there. Want to recognize Jonathan Greeley too for his accessibility. Mike Christopher's here as well, and many others. Your planning department, especially, and your project managers are, the numerous ones that we have to work with are all very accessible and responsive. So I just wanted to thank you on that. And I'm happy to hear, and I know it's been 3 years now.
Just
Brian?
over 3, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
Yep.
And, you took over an agency that had identified a lot of shortcomings. And I'm happy to hear about the 94% lease success. Can you speak a little bit to how we're tracking that? Is most people up to up to date with their payments and such that wasn't necessarily happening regularly before?
Sure. The process we've put in place using, again, state-of-the-art software brought our monitoring and enforcement approach to leasing from the mid-20th century into the 21st century. Was literally an analog approach to the task. Lots of hard copy leases sitting in filing cabinets and sort of an ad hoc arrangement of enforcing provisions in it. These documents, though, are not 2 or 3 page leases the way one might think of a lease in terms of a residential apartment rental. These are massive documents with a wide variety of significant material provisions, sometimes very complex. And we were relying on human judgment, human focus to peruse those documents on a perceived as needed basis. It was no way to run a sophisticated operation. And we, as I pointed out, continue to own significant land and sometimes significant structures and ground lease them for long periods of time. So we've digitized everything. We've digitized the leases. We've abstracted every single one of them, pulling the material provisions out of each. So that was the initial phase. What are the material provisions? Do we have them in a database that can easily that allows us to easily monitor those material provisions and enforce them? So what we're going through now is each material provision and make sure that it is in fact being enforced. So it was just getting the information in an accessible vehicle, Yardi software. And now we're using that information and making sure that each leasing relationship is being properly managed and enforced. And it's going very, very well. Again, it was expensive, it was time consuming, a lot of labor, and some significant new software acquisition, but we're almost where we need to be. And I don't see a potential for these significant leases to continue to fail to make the payments required of them. As was discussed back in 2014 when KPMG came in and looked at the operation, they were looking at people who were significantly behind in arrears on their payments. And they identified multiple instances in which material provisions of the leases should have been enforced and been required to pay significant money to the landlord, the people of Boston, as represented by the BPDA. and there were significant gaps where payments were not made that should have been made. Again, given the software in the system that we've embraced, we don't see any possibility of that recurring.
Right. So, in short, you feel confident that people are up to date in their payments and the provisions of said leases are being enforced.
Yes, to the extent that we might have a lapse in payment, it's something that would be readily discerned. KPMG pointed out payments that should have been made years ago that the agency was unaware of because no one was scrutinizing or monitoring or enforcing these hard copy leases. But now the mechanism allows us to do that. If there's a failure or an arrearage to make a required payment, we'd pick up on that pretty quickly.
Great. I wanted to recognize that Council President Michelle Wu has joined us as well. And I know this reminds me, this council tasked you during the whole urban renewal discussion and working sessions about the LDAs. Can you give us an update on the inventory, how that's progressing?
Sure. So the LDAs, Mr. Chairman, are the land disposition agreements that often accompanied the disposition of a piece of property back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when the Boston Redevelopment Authority acquired property, turned it around, put it out for redevelopment, and ultimately may have sold it. In some cases, land was sold. In a lot of cases, land was sold. In some cases, it was retained but leased for 65, 99 years. So a variety of potential disposition outcomes. But usually when a piece of property was sold, a land disposition agreement was accompanied that disposition, which would limit the new owner's ability to do with that property what they desired. For instance, we might require that the disposition, again, above and beyond any existing zoning, the LDA may have said this parcel must be used for housing, this parcel must be used for commercial. We'd specify the uses, and in those LDAs, there are still several hundred of them in existence, maybe over 1,000 throughout the city. When again, they originated because the BRA owned land, conveyed it to a new developer, but retained some regulatory control through those LDAs. But as has been pointed out multiple times in formal proceedings here at the City Council, those LDAs, they might be sitting in the registry of deeds, but they were not cohesively maintained in a single place, in a single database at the BRA. We've changed that. We've cycled through much of the south end, identifying the LDAs there, and we're examining those LDAs to see are these uses that were required for these parcels still the uses that the community would embrace today, so that we can rethink whether or not the existing LDA is necessary or not. So, but again, the first order of business, just like the leases, was collecting the documents, making sure we knew where there was an LDA, where there wasn't, and where there was an LDA, examining the use, making sure that use was reflected in today's reality. The property was in fact being used for the purpose identified in the LDA, and then making decisions. Ultimately, we'll work with the community and with the council to make decisions about those LDAs going forward. Are those requirements, are those regulatory controls, are those use restrictions still the use restrictions we'd like to see today? So we've spent significant time on the smaller urban renewal areas in the downtown Boston. We've been down a few times to talk about them. Some in the downtown crossing area, some here in Government Center, both urban renewal areas. We've spent a lot of time on the south end, LDAs, and now we're starting in Charlestown. We're underway in Charlestown.
And I would just point out that one of those LDAs served the neighbors in the North End particularly well when Spalding actually is moving to Brighton, which I'm thrilled about and embrace 100%, but it left a vacancy in the North End area. And after further, investigation, we found an LDA that said that it has to remain a nursing home.
Absolutely, Counselor.
Right.
So, very simply put, the nursing home that you're referencing on Fulton Street in the North End was created as a result of a parcel that the then BRA, once owned, conveyed for private development, but subject to a very basic restriction. It must be a nursing home.
Right.
And so that LDA, which is still extant, has served the residents of the North End well, because as Spalding pulls away from that nursing home facility in the North End and sets up shop in Brighton, a new operator is acquiring the site and will operate it as a nursing home.
Right. I think that's great news for the North End. Councilor Savi George.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I do want to apologize that after this round of questions, I do have to leave. I promise that that's the exception rather than the rule for these hearings. The BRA owns quite a bit of property that you're collecting rental revenue and lease revenue from, for example, the parking lots. Do any of those properties or the BPDA pay any real estate tax or property tax to the city for that, or any sort of compensation to the city?
Right.
N-
No,
No.
not at this juncture, no.
And is it because you're an agency as opposed to a
W-
for-profit entity?
Right. We're exempt from local taxation.
So, how much of that property do you own, and how much of that have we sold off, say, even in the last few years?
I'm sorry, how much of
That
the
property that would be a property taxed or a taxable property, how much of that have we sold off so that it could be a tax generating property?
Oh, I see. I actually don't have that. I don't know how much you're saying. I think what you're saying is how much have we moved from exempt to taxable for the city? So how much revenue have we generated for the city based on transferring property to other people?
You've asked it so much better than me.
Well, no, it's a lot of years in the budget office for the city. I don't actually have that number, but I would also state that in the Charlestown Navy Yard, I believe all those properties are taxable, and they are on the tax rolls. Our other property at China Trade and the Marine Industrial Park.
Sure, thank you, Chris. That's important to point out. If there's a private residential development or private commercial entity, private industrial entity that happens to be sitting on BPDA-owned dirt on land through a ground lease, that entity is paying to the city, in I would imagine almost all cases, either bona fide property taxes or some kind of payment in lieu of taxes that might have been the subject of an arrangement worked out with the agency and the city in years past. There is a concerted effort to move any private development that continues to occur on BPDA-owned property onto straight Chapter 59 bona fide property taxes. So when that land is developed, even if we own the dirt, so to speak, and the developer is developing subject to a long-term ground lease with us, they're going to pay, in the vast majority of instances, property taxes, or in some niche instances, a pilot.
Okay, and at the full rate, at what a private property owner would be paying,
It-
with those few exceptions?
Yes, it's an important question. There are still a significant number of properties, for instance, over in Marine Industrial Park, the Ray Flynn Marine Park. Some are Chapter 59 paying straight property taxes, just like anybody else, whether they were on BPD-owned property or not. They're paying Chapter 59, or they might be paying a pilot. The pilots were often done. As you may know, we acquired the Marine Park from the federal government in the 70s. And to lure development there over the past 4 decades, there would often have been BPDA enters into a ground lease, and it might have been a fairly discounted ground lease because, again, we are trying to attract tenants. that were providing jobs and economic vitality to a former Department of Defense base that had been abandoned by the federal government. So we were incentivizing people to come. We probably would have done a good deal on a ground lease. And back then, the city may have done a pilot agreement in which it discounted the property taxes and did a pilot instead of Chapter 59. That's increasingly gone away. There are some of those legacy deals because they might have been 65 or 99-year deals. But when we have the opportunity to relook a taxation deal, our agreement with the city is, generally speaking, to move those properties onto Chapter 59 bona fide property taxes.
I can add just one thing. We've been meeting with the assessing department over the past year or so, and we've identified properties in the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, and when their leases expired and when they would move to taxable, so that the assessing department has a very good idea of when things will become taxable, if they're not already. And a
That's
lot
great.
of them are.
And that's a question I'll follow up with them just to sort of have an understanding of what may be coming down the pike.
Mhm.
And sort of at a greater concern, or maybe sort of the initiating concern, is any property, taxable property that then gets purchased by a different entity, by a college, by a university that is tax exempt fully. Are we making any efforts to try to preserve some of that lost revenue as it, as the land is purchased by a university or institution?
Sure, Counselor, again, if you're talking about property that this agency owns, I can't think recently of an instance in which a nonprofit has purchased BPDA-owned land and removed it from the tax rolls. I think that would be a sensitive subject if it did come up, and there'd probably be a lot of questions and scrutiny from both the city council, the administration, as well as us. But Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I can't think of a nonprofit that has acquired any significant, I'm sorry.
Only because, and it hasn't broken ground yet, but the property on Chestnut Hill Ave that went to JCHE, which hasn't been built yet.
Sure.
So that would be one of.
Absolutely,
just comes to
Counselor.
mind.
And to your point, it was, again, not an academic institution or a medical.
Sold, too.
It was a nonprofit.
Right.
That has acquired a piece of land. It's a mission-oriented nonprofit that provides affordable housing to seniors, and it's on Chestnut Hill Ave, just outside of Brighton Center. The agency sold that parcel, I believe, in 2014, and it's being developed now as 70 units of affordable housing. So I think something we'd look at in that instance is cost-benefit analysis, yes, being removed from the tax rolls, but at the same time, providing high-quality, affordable housing to seniors. That's a deal that probably the BPDA and the city had a high degree of comfort with because of the social good that it would provide.
I'd say the other problem is in a role that the BRA could, I think, play a heavier hand in, is when nonprofits, universities, institutions, whoever, come before the BRA for their own property that they've taken off. So they've made a private transaction with the property owner. They're going to build dorms. They're going to grow their institutional campus. Whatever it is that they do, that property now comes off the property tax rolls. Is there a way that we can keep that property at least paying the taxes?
I think, Counselor, at the sort of most basic way to manage that type of a situation is probably through the institutional master planning process, which the Boston Planning and Development Agency oversees. Most institutions, universities, medical institutions, have an IMP, an institutional master plan. And through that process, very often the institutional master plan is a 5 to 10-year document that governs what the university or the medical institution, as the case may be, will do in the years going forward with regard to acquisition and development of land. So that conversation about what the city and a neighborhood has an appetite for with regard to university expansion, university acquisition of private property and its removal from the tax rolls would go on at that IMP stage. And I think that's where we would be most likely to be examining whether or not a university or medical institution's appetites for acquisition of private property and removal from the tax roll was appropriate or not.
Has the BPDA ever had a transaction like that with an agreement that would keep the property tax coming into the city? So when an institution wants to grow, regardless of hospital, university, have they come before the BPDA with their institutional master plan or with a planned growth that removes private property that produced taxes, taking it off the property taxing rolls? Has there ever been an instance where
But has voluntarily agreed, is that to
I guess
to
voluntarily
maintain?
agreed. Have we asked them to continue to pay as if it were paying into the property taxes?
I don't want to speculate on that. I don't know.
I don't think so.
I tend to doubt it. I would
Right.
think that conversation would take place in the context primarily of pilot payments from the universities. I know it's a contentious issue. What should universities be voluntarily paying to the city, given that they do have a legal tax exempt status, and what it's a challenging issue because they are by law tax exempt. So the pilot is a voluntary mechanism. So when do you use the regulatory power of the BPDA or the City of Boston to extract a concession from somebody who has a legal right not to pay taxes? It's a very delicate and legally sensitive matter. So these conversations occur more in the context of, and that's a continues to pay. Okay. So what's a staff member just provided me with an instance in which Boston College at 2000 Commonwealth Ave removed a private residential development could have removed a private residential development from a tax roll. They acquired it, an apartment building at 2000 Commonwealth Avenue in Brighton, acquired it and turned it into a dormitory. At that point, the university would have been within its legal rights to stop paying Chapter 59 property taxes, but the university did voluntarily, in that instance, maintain the property tax payments.
They're actually still paying per unit like a condo fee. And we were all very involved in that negotiation way back, and happy to say that they are still. They actually sued the city, though, and won in a tax appellate court, if I remember correctly, that if they do choose to turn it into a dorm, they can. That's just my recollection.
All right, thank you.
But they're voluntarily
I
paying.
appreciate that. Thank you. I'm all.
Oh, great. Councilor Zakem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director, all, welcome. On Councilor Sabi George's topic on pilot payments and institutional master plans, I have one what I hope is a quick question is, what is the remedy or penalty when institutions are in violation of their IMP or they disregard it? I mean, we just say, don't do that? Are they barred from future projects? Is there a financial penalty? Are there remedies in court?
I don't have a recollection of any recent activity in which the requirements of an institutional master plan were enforced in a court of law. And I believe that's because primarily there are softer mechanisms by which the will of the public sector is felt, whether it's through the Boston Planning Development Agency, the Inspectional Services Department for the City of Boston. There could be a variety of regulatory.
Because I think in particular of Berkeley school in the Fenway Symphony area on Clearway Street. There are quite a few residents there, and this has been for a couple years, where despite an IMP that did not include student housing on that street, there was the deals made with the landlord, sort of converting in effect into dorms. Now, I don't think the school owns the property, but they were facilitating that. And certainly I hear from my constituents that why do we go to these meetings and hash out an IMP, et cetera, if there's no remedy for that. So
Sure. Now, I think where the facts clearly cut one way, you probably would see an enforcement activity from the city with regard to whether or not a property was being operated and or licensed appropriately as a dormitory or not. I would think most of the difficulty is in the gray areas. Is that a dorm or isn't it? And there may be good faith disagreement about whether or not it's actually functioning as a legal dorm. I'd say that the softer way of that generally being worked out is perhaps with the city, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and the community working to achieve a consensus on what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate on an IMP. Because one thing's for sure, most of these universities and medical institutions aren't going anywhere. They're going to be with us forever, and that's a good thing. That's what makes Boston Boston in so many ways. But they need to continue to maintain an institutional master plan as a specific condition of continuing to do building and development. So that piece of it, the absolute need of a university and a medical institution to constantly update their physical plant and be able to pull building permits requires an existing IMP, and that IMP is always hovering over
which and I appreciate that. I think the IMP is incredibly important. I just think whether it's some egregious examples or some other ones, I think holding institutions of all kinds, our colleges, universities, whomever, to an IMP. Because we ask a lot, I think, of our neighbors, folks who I think often feel the positives and the negatives of being surrounded by some of these large institutions, but they come to these meetings. They work with your great staff, and the universities, and I think everyone is in good faith during the IMP planning process, but it is incredibly frustrating, and for me personally, to participate in that and then feel sometimes that it's not coming. So, making sure that we're on top of that. And I think as part of the IMP process or any development process, how much of a factor, or how does your board or your staff look at institutions' pilot payments or their record of making pilot contributions to the city when we're reviewing plans? Now, I think, dorms, I think we need more of. We had Sheila Dillon and her team in here earlier today, and that was great. But a lot of these schools are just adding laboratory space, classrooms, which are, no problem with that. But I think it's a lot to, again, ask the city to support expansion when some of these institutions are making de minimis pilot payments. And how does that play into your evaluation of
Sure, Counselor, and I appreciate the frustration that you're expressing on behalf of a whole lot of people in the city, having grown up in Alston, Brighton, which has got some significant university presence.
Sure.
The formal campuses of Harvard, BC, and BU are in large part in Alston, Brighton, but also the neighborhood is permeated with people associated with those universities. They add so much to life. They're good for the city. They're good for the metropolitan Boston area. But at the same time, I can't emphasize this enough. These institutions, I think we can all acknowledge, have a legal right.
Sure.
They have a clear legal right to be exempt from property taxes. And for us to condition our official actions on whether or not in a university or a medical institution is voluntarily paying property taxes, that gets potentially dangerously close to coercion, forcing the payment of the pilot, which they are legally not required to pay. forcing them to pay it by conditioning future approvals of development projects or institutional master plans is legally problematic. So I think what we would say is we don't condition our official decision-making, the exercise of discretionary government authority, on someone's willingness or unwillingness to pay
Well,
pilots. But at the same time, I think the sort of nuance to this, why it's so challenging, is very often when a university or medical institution comes before us for a planning effort or a project, they want community support. They try to earn and develop community support for their efforts. Very often that's where a conversation might be occurring, but in the university's effort to gain support for something from the public, they might make a commitment, they might focus more on pilots, but it's
Well, I
not
think
for
it's-
us.
Well, I think, when you say discretionary authority, of the BRA, of the city agencies, is important. It is discretion. And I think when we are weighing.
Not unlimited.
Sure.
Right.
But I think when we are weighing whether someone is a good institutional citizen of the city of Boston, that is an important factor. Whether it's direct pilot payments, whether it's contributions to the neighborhood, whether it's making sure that their neighbors are heard, whether it's on student life issues that Councilor Siomo and I deal with all the time, or others. So we don't need to belabor the point. I have just one other item I wanted to address. I talked about it with Chief Dillon in the D&D hearing earlier, about expiring use projects, affordable housing in the city. And one in my district, in an area that is familiar to you, on the West End, the Amy Lowell House, it's got some time still. It looks like 2029 for the expiring use, but there's some question of whether that building or that land is subject to an LDA. Obviously it's in an urban renewal zone. It's in perhaps the most infamous urban renewal zone in the city. So looking to see what, if any, leverage we would have to preserve that affordability, and also on the broader sense of things, what your agency can do to, one, try to preserve a lot of this expiring use. I mean, we hear from Chief Dillon and her team about the reduction in federal funding. So I think we're all committed to looking everywhere we can to not just create new affordable housing, which I think you guys are doing a good job, and D&D is doing a good job, and we're trying to accelerate that, but to preserve what's already there, which may be facing some expiring use.
Sure. So generally, Counselor, first of all, I'm happy to look at Amy Lowell. I'd like to think we can figure out pretty quickly whether or not there is an LDA and what the LDA requires for that particular parcel. I would guess there's a strong likelihood that, again, as you mentioned, where it was, the West End, which at one point or another, the vast majority of it was owned, however briefly, by the BRA. And when the parcels were conveyed, they very often were conveyed with an LDA. So there may, in fact, be one there, and we'll figure that out and see what opportunities it affords us to continue to perpetuate the affordable housing that exists there. Second, the thing that owns us most, I think, that the macro issue that we obsess about at the BPDA is how in arguably the biggest building boom in the city's history, 80% of it is residential, but most of that residential stock that's being built and brought online is in fact market. We bend over backwards to figure out mechanisms, either through regulatory controls or funding sources, working closely with the city assessor on perhaps tax relief that could flow toward a provider of affordable housing. Those conversations are always going on because we want to incentivize that creation. So where we can use tax policy or our regulatory tools, or even our land. If we actually have a piece of land or a sliver of land that could be added to the mix of a parcel that helps it achieve perhaps its goals for site assembly, perhaps we can use that contribution of land to lower the costs and incentivize the creation of affordable housing. The examples we cite often is parcel 1B over in the Bullfinch Triangle, a former DOT site, working closely with other city agencies, the assessors, private development, which threw off affordable housing cash through our IDP program over at North Station. It helped subsidize the creation of affordable housing
That's a great project.
over at
I
1B.
talk
So
about all the time.
you're right, it's a tough one because there were so many different programs and revenue streams that were necessary to tap. So we had the planets line up well on that one. Try to get the planets to line up in other places too. And we work hard at that. We've had some significant successes, but the demand is great and it's easier to build market rate housing than affordable, so it requires that much more effort on our part.
No, I appreciate that, and that's a great project down by North Station. It's something that I think people point to as a successful way of public-private partnerships, city and state, and private, for-profit, nonprofit, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just close by saying I want to make sure that we're also looking, though, at not just creation, but expiring use and all the resources of the city. I know Chief Dillon's office is working on that, and I know it's a concern for you. I don't mean to imply it's not, but just want to think if there are ways looking forward to not looking forward to, but expecting a pretty disastrous federal budget, especially around housing issues. I just want to make sure we're firing on all cylinders. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And since we were talking about IMPs, it reminded me of Gerald Otler, who's been the project manager for both BC and Harvard for many years. He does a great job, so I just want to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted just to recognize how exciting it is that the budget book I'm hearing will be available to the public and online. Such a huge step and really wonderful for transparency. So looking forward to that. I wonder if, I know because you have a separate board, it's sort of similar to the school committee process where it's not just controlled by the council and agencies' timing in terms of when we can discuss that budget. But in future years, any way that the board could vote on it earlier so that at this hearing before the council, we can actually be looking at that book or even though it will have been finalized to some extent by the board so that the conversations we're having are much more about the numbers that you're preparing.
Yeah, I think we could look into that, right?
That would be nirvana for us if we could come down here with that buttoned up. I just say in my observations, having been at the agency for 8 years and almost 3.5 as director, the challenge we're often up against with regard to our particular revenue streams is they're volatile. Now, times are good now, but I think this is just something worth thinking about. Up until the early 1990s, there was some significant city funding involvement in the operations of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. For instance, the city appropriated funds to pay for the functions of the planning division. And that was always viewed as a traditional city role. The planning department had been absorbed by the BRA in the early 60s, and the city continued to fund that piece of it. That funding went away. We're almost entirely self-sustaining now, except for some very discrete slivers of money, as Chris mentioned earlier, that flow for capital purposes to the BRA. I think this year it might be $1.5 million. Is that what it was?
1.5.
1.5. So our antennae are always quivering from month to month with regard to cash flow. So we've tended to defer actual crafting and ultimate ratification, finalization of the budget until the very end of the fiscal year when we have a firm understanding of where we are with regard to cash today and in the coming 12 months. In 2008, after the Great Recession was upon us in the fall of 2008, a recession coupled with a financial crisis, in the next year or two, the BRA lost 18% of its workforce because its revenue picture imploded overnight. Now, the city's fiscal house, it did not go unscathed. I mean, everybody's affected, but you have a much more diverse revenue portfolio. We have just a few. It's basically the land leases, the ground leases that we administer. That's how we pay for our functions, not through city council appropriation. But when the city's the BRA's workforce contracted by 18% in about an 18-month period, so that's a real body blow. And when we face a crisis like that, the only way we can get ourselves and our budget back into balance is through massive staff reductions. It happened in 2009. There was a reduction of several dozen people in the early 90s with that 89 to 92 recession. So that's how we fix our budget when it's broken. So again, we approach this task very conservatively with a heightened sense of caution, and we don't make plans, frankly, until we absolutely have to, because our picture is more volatile than yours. I think I heard once that the city's workforce contracted after 2008 in the ensuing years, mostly through attrition, by about 6%. But in that roughly the same time frame, ours contracted by 3 times that number, which again just tells you something about the volatility of our budget.
So I understand from your side, wanting to, not bring on additional exposure unnecessarily when the numbers aren't settled and you want to wrap up all the loose ends before the end of the fiscal year. I mean, I would defer to our Ways and Means chairman, but maybe it's a conversation of, because we're not technically voting on the BRA budget when we take our budget votes, could we push this one hearing until late, right after the June 15th vote or something? I just think it'd be helpful to have
would be-
hard numbers.
Right. The only
but-
reason we couldn't probably is because we need to vote on capital, actually,
Yep.
the beginning of June, and then reject the budget. So I don't know. I think
Well, let's keep talking about
We
it,
should
but-
keep talking about it. It's a matter of a couple of weeks,
Right.
maybe. That would make a difference, too.
Sure, it absolutely would, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah,
But
I
no,
mean-
we're happy, philosophically,
Absolutely. No,
I'm
I
with
think,
you.
Yeah, exactly. We're all moving in the same direction. And I mean, you all know it was important to me in my urban renewal vote to know that these budget, the sort of opening up of the budget was coming. And so really, really thrilled that you're delivering on that this year with putting everything online in the form of the budget book. But I just wish we could have lined it up. So for next year, still work to go. There's been a lot of, I think, overflow since we were with D&D earlier in the day. My overflow is that we were discussing some of the policy innovations coming out of the Housing Innovation Lab, and the implementation of density bonuses, for example, through the 2 planning area, to the studies in JP Rocks and Plan.eb. So a lot of the new thinking about housing policy is coming through you all, and zoning, and having those conversations with residents. Do you plan to push that out more widely than these 2 areas, particularly around density bonuses?
Yes. We view, as do lots of other large cities that are approaching growing populations while at the same time facing gentrification and displacement, and the need to create affordable housing for those who live in the city, as well as those yet to come. We think density bonuses are an important tool. It's not a panacea. They're not going to fix the problem writ large, but they are an important device in incentivizing the creation of affordable housing in exchange for density. And we'd like to think we can do those density bonuses largely with the support of communities who see value coming from them, that the density may bring something other than not just the affordable units, though those are prized, but other amenities that might accompany large-scale development. If we can get community support, primarily by doing this, significant heightened density in places that are super transit-oriented, with significant mass transit access nearby, that we can achieve that consensus, implement density bonuses, actually build buildings that reflect those density bonuses, and create affordable housing. So I think that's an important philosophical underpinning as we roll out each one of these strategic planning areas in a variety of different neighborhoods.
Do you think the way that the two have gone so far have been a pretty good template for how you'll continue to do them in terms of timeline and process?
I think the first two, Dorchester Ave and JP Rocks, we're testing the concept. We were embracing new ways of engaging neighborhoods, not just the BPDA showing up at a school auditorium and presenting its thoughts on what should happen in a given bit of planning geography, but soliciting people in small group conversations. We refer to a lot of our engagement that we've been employing with a lot of public support as the science fair approach, that we would have multiple stations in many of our community gatherings in which residents who are interested in transportation could go here, residents interested in affordable housing can go there, residents who are interested in bike lanes, you name it, that you could focus on the area that really animated and interested you and talk to a subject matter expert, one of our planners, and make sure your voice was heard. So we thought this, by and large, worked well. People like the way we're engaging in the community now. Now, was there serious political contention? Yes. Some of these issues are very contentious. Emotions can run high when topics of gentrification and displacement and affordability rear their heads in a planning. But we've got to embrace that. We've got to keep making our argument, keep expressing our conviction that the work we're doing is going to benefit all Bostonians, not just those who can handle market rate and luxury units downtown, but that everybody in every neighborhood can benefit by a sensitive approach to development that also recognizes that growth is coming. The city continues to attract several thousand people a year in a net gain of population, and they're going somewhere. We need to build stock to accommodate a growing Boston. And one thing's for sure, if we don't do it, and this is our message in all of our community planning efforts over the past 3 years, if we don't build new stock, the pressure on existing stock gets so much greater and drives those prices up and assures that some of our most vulnerable populations are in fact displaced. So growing the numbers of housing units in the city is absolutely crucial to mitigating displacement. And again, we're testing methodologies and we're refining our arguments. This is new to us. As we've mentioned many times down here, we're doing more planning than we historically have done in recent years, maybe recent decades. So we're having the back and forth and constantly learning what really motivates people, what animates them, and making sure that we think long and hard about the best response to those concerns that we're hearing.
So along those lines, in order to keep building, as our sort of open parcels are all conveyed and get filled in, we're starting to talk about the complicated ones with air rights and decking and this and that. So how are you all thinking about it sort of proactively and from a planning lens, rather than just letting different developers approach the city saying, we'd like to do this, it's hard, can you help us make it fit? But having that conversation with residents ahead of time.
Sure. So we're doing a variety of different things. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the agency historically was met by the public in the neighborhoods when a large real estate development project was being presented. That's how you generally met. That's how you generally dealt with the BRA. And as part of our relook at how we do business in the neighborhoods, and part of that yielded a name change where we focus upon planning, we specifically call it out in our new name, is to reflect that people want to hear from us, not just when there's a 600-unit residential building being proposed in their neighborhood. They want to hear from us before that. So we're doing these strategic planning areas in key corridors where we think height and density and new units are appropriate. But you're meeting us in a planning context, often before a development is being presented. So we're doing those planning efforts, these granular parcel by parcel planning efforts in key strategic areas within the city. But we're also going out and just explaining ourselves. Here's what we do. Here's what our tools are. Here's what our powers are. Breaking down Article 80, which, unless you're the most savvy, sophisticated community activist, is not easily accessible or digestible to the average resident. So we're breaking it down. Here's what our Article 80 is, and here are the opportunities within Article 80 for you to have your voice heard. So we're doing that neighborhood by neighborhood, independent of a project. We think you should be talking to us and hearing from us and sharing your opinions with us in a context other than just a big project is being presented. We think it demystifies and gives people an opportunity for a meaningful voice. So we're engaging differently, and I think that the more we do this over time, people understand us more, and we're explaining not just processes, not just technicalities, rules, and regulations. We're explaining, here's how we, the planners and staff at the BPDA, look at your neighborhood. Here are some of the fundamental facts we're grappling with regard to your built environment and your demographics. What do you think about these things? And we're providing information about your neighborhood, some of it that might not be readily apparent to neighbors. As I mentioned, we have a significant, robust research capability at the BPDA. It's really the city's biggest research unit. And we study the neighborhood. And sometimes when we talk to the neighborhoods about what we're looking at, people are surprised at some of the facts that we're able to provide them with. And they better understand why we make the decisions we do. So again, it's about acting differently in the neighborhoods on a consistent basis over time. And we think that people will accept that we are a bona fide planning agency that's looking for their input before we're showing up with a large real estate development project.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have the latest population numbers? Like, what's the most recent population for the city right now?
I probably haven't heard it in over a month, but I think as of the past 2 months, I think the number is 670,000,
Okay.
which is the biggest we've been since the 1960s. Again, and by the end of World War II, Boston had 800,000 people living in it.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1980, that had dropped to 560,000 people. And now we're back up about 110,000 over that 1980 number.
Right, and it's grew significantly in the past 8 years.
You're right. The past 5 or 6 years,
five
it's
or
several
six.
thousand a year. From 1980 to 2010, we were adding about 1,500 people a year. It grew from about 50,000 people in a 30-year time frame, a net gain of 50,000 people in a 30-year time frame. In the past 6 years, it's grown by about 45,000 people.
Right.
So we're
Mm-hmm.
at a much brisker pace of population growth than has historically been the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did have D&D here earlier, and some of the testimony was around, is the luxury segment of the housing production driving up all prices? And I think it's an interesting thought. I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I think supply helps, or demand increases prices when there's not enough supply. Is that how the agency operates under those economic premises?
Sure. First and foremost, we don't think that the market can address all that ails the city's housing market in 2017. The affordable product is much harder to create, much harder to generate with the tools available to us. Primarily funding. It's funding driven, as multiple councils have mentioned here today. the federal government probably isn't going to increase the amount of money to support the creation of affordable housing for the foreseeable future. Our biggest fear is how bad is the decrease. So we're dealing with limited resources, but we think while the market can't take care of everything, more housing at all levels is better. The more market rate housing created, the less likely the occupants of those units are to go into the neighborhoods with lots of working class folks and low income folks and bid up the price of the rental units or the purchase opportunities. I think that's clear, and that's not really a left-right premise. I think people on all sides of the along the political spectrum agree with that the pressure on existing stock gets much worse if we don't build. So
I agree with that.
and you know, Mr. Chairman, what's pretty important, sometimes people ask, you know, you're permitting too much market rate stuff, especially downtown. You see a lot of significant residential towers going up. Is there too much of it? In a city like Boston, I'm not sure what too much means. Too much means if there's more supply than there is demand, the prices will drop. And if the prices drop precipitously on some of these downtown market rate towers, that's fundamentally pretty good news.
Right.
Those units become more accessible to people who otherwise couldn't afford them. Might be the developer's problem. It's not your problem, and it's not our problem. So we welcome the notion that more supply will soften the prices that can be charged for these market rate products.
And lastly, Chief Dillon, I asked her a similar question about the market, and she's reporting that they're seeing a 4% drop in rental prices across the city. Is that same data that you're seeing?
Sure, there's a variety of data, and most of the data that comes out of city government on those issues is coming from places like the Boston Planning and Development Agency's research division. And if you look, sometimes the sample is some of the hot neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that have really got significant demographic bulges. Then others look at the city as a whole, and then still others, you'll often see it, for instance, in the Boston Business Journal or Banker and Tradesman. The mainstream media covers this with some regularity. If you look at it at metropolitan Boston, you'll still see other numbers. But I think generally speaking, we are seeing softening on rents in individual neighborhoods, the hottest neighborhoods, the city as a whole, as well as the metro region. It differs depending on, obviously, the geography that you're sampling, but most of the reporting, most of the analysis that we've seen on housing cost is pointing to modest reductions in rents.
And you said could you provide us with the neighborhood breakdown?
Sure, I can get you whatever we have.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Great. That concludes today's hearing with our talented group of folks from the BPDA, and we will stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.